Well, good evening. Welcome to the Jesus Movement Line live. Welcome to everyone who's joining us online. We're on our 64th lesson in our series, A Journey to Faith. Tonight's lesson is actually the last of the lessons where we're going to be looking at the kings, because as of tonight there will be no more kings available in Judah. So tonight's lessons are called The Destruction of Jerusalem and Babylonian Exile. So the exile's already started because there's more than one. Tonight will be the final exile that occurs. So whilst we're at this point, last week we had a look at Jehoiakim and how he was taken off into exile. So I'm just going to put up a couple of screens just to refresh who the different people are at this point in time. And so the first screen which we pop up, we've had Jehoiakim already taken away into exile. And so we found that the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, he took the uncle of Jehoiakim, who was called Mattaniah, and he changed his name to Zedekiah when he made him king. And so we entered into this the previous week. Zedekiah rules for a period of 11 years, so he has a fair old reign. But tonight we're going to see what his story is, which is not particularly good. And we find out how he switches allegiance, unfortunately, and this causes the situation. When his reign comes to an end, he's actually replaced by a governor, so no more kings, and the governor's name is Gedaliah. So the next screen we have is just to talk about the prophets, and so the prophets here, so again we're down here to Zedekiah and Jehoiakim. Back at Josiah, we had Jeremiah come into play. Jeremiah is still here at this point in time, and we've got Daniel, who's now in Babylonian exile. And tonight we're going to move quite heavily into Ezekiel, because his role with the Lord comes into play. So the main scriptures for tonight are going to come from Jeremiah and Ezekiel. Now just to give a refresh, I'll just move over to this other side here. To give a refresh, this map, we showed this on the previous lesson, but basically we've got Jerusalem over here with the kingdom of Judah. We've got Babylon over here, and we've got this path which is mapped out, which is the path that's actually taken for the exiles. So when they took them, they would go up the coast and they would have this staging place at Hamath. And at Hamath there's a river system there called the Orontes. So it's a good place for them to have a break, and then they move across and they pick up the Euphrates River up here, and they trace down past Mari all the way down to Babylon. And last week we talked about this place called Nippur, and we're going to look at that a lot more tonight. So what we have is Jeremiah still in Jerusalem. So the Lord's placed him as a prophet beside Zedekiah, who's now going to rule. In Babylon we find that Daniel has already gone there, and he in fact is the king who's ruling. His three friends, we covered last week about the story when they went into the fire and the Lord was there. And so what's going to happen, we find that we have a ruler for Babylon, and we also have administrators to administrate the kingdom of Babylon, or the state of Babylon. And then the actual exiles, majority of the people, there was 10,000, actually went down to this place called Nippur, which is about 80 kilometres to the south. And this is where they're actually living. And we have that song, by the rivers of Babylon, and it says rivers. And the reason is because there's actually a section here where the river splits into two, and so there's water either side. And so this place is known, there's the Kebar River, and they have all of these canals cut between them for irrigation. And so we find that Ezekiel is amongst those people there. And so when we're looking at this, we have the Lord has put Daniel to rule Babylon, the three administrators with him. We have Ezekiel with the people who have been taken into exile, and we have Jeremiah remaining behind in Jerusalem with Zedekiah. Now, what we have here is what's called the remnant. So the Lord decided that they were the people who were evil. They're the ones who are continuing on worshipping false idols. But the quantity who have been taken over this way, the Lord considers them to be good people. And so when we look at Jeremiah's prophecy, the well-known misdiagnosed prophecy of Jeremiah 29:11. He took the people over here and he told them to prosper, to build their homes, plant their crops, because this is where they're going to live. We also spoke about how there's going to be 70 years of rule for Babylon. So not 70 years of exile, but 70 years of rule, because there's actually 4 lots of exile that actually happen. And so the generation here, if you can imagine, if I'm an adult that's been taken into exile, if it's 70 years until I come back, I'm probably not going to come back. I'm going to be too old. And so it's actually the next generation and the next generation's children who are actually going to come back. And so this is why the Lord said to go and prosper, get on with your lives. I'm going to take care of you. He's placed people to rule the nation. He's placed people to administer it. And he's also placed a prophet to be beside them. And of course we've got Jeremiah communicating back and forth by letter from the other side. And so we can see that the Lord's hand is completely on this situation, because he's going to punish his people. He's going to clear the decks. There's going to be no more kingdoms after Zedekiah, and but he will return his people back to the land again. So that's sort of a brief outline of where we're up to. So beginning with Ezekiel. Ezekiel is the son of a priest called Buzi, B-U-Z-I. And he was amongst the exiles taken to Babylon with King Jehoiakim. So I forgot to mention, so King Jehoiakim is in exile, but he's been kept in the northern palace next to the Ishtar gate of Babylon. And so he's captive with his children there. And so he's over there as well. On the 5th day of the 4th month in the 5th year of King Jehoiakim's exile, he was amongst other exiles by the Kebar River, southeast of Babylon. And it says in Ezekiel chapter 1 verse 1, our first scripture for tonight, Ezekiel 1 verse 1, that the heavens were opened and he saw visions of God. So as an exile, Ezekiel always referred to Jehoiakim as king, and every occasion was dated by how many years his king had been in exile. So we can see the positioning of where they are, because they had different calendar systems that were operating in Judah than they did in Babylon. And so the dating and the communication, because Ezekiel's over here with the exilarch, the now ex-king, he always references Jehoiakim. And so that's what we see happening here. He actually never mentions Zedekiah at all. So Zedekiah, who is ruling back in Judah, is not mentioned whatsoever. It's only Jehoiakim by Ezekiel. Okay, so on that day in 593 BC, the Lord came to him in the land of the Babylonians by the Kebar River. Ezekiel described what he saw. And so we're going to go again in Ezekiel chapter 1, and we're going to read from verses 4 to 6 and a portion from verses 10 to 11. So beginning with verse 4, he said, I looked and I saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning and surrounded by brilliant light. The centre of the fire looked like glowing metal, and in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. In appearance, their form was that of a man, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. In verses 10 to 11 it carries on, says, each of the 4 had the face of a man, and on the right side each had the face of a lion, and on the left the face of an ox. Each also had the face of an eagle. And so here's a diagram which has those 4 figures there. I'm going to ask the question, because we've had these up before a long time ago. When was the last time that we looked at those 4 faces? Do you remember what they're connected to?
The tribes.
Right,
The main leaders of the tribes.
Correct, very good. So the 12 tribes, when they're down in Mount Sinai, they were grouped together into 4 tribes of 3. And each of them were given a banner, and each of these were represented on that banner. And so we find now this connection with Ezekiel's prophecy, where he's talking about the same 4 images that are actually being seen. So continuing on, it says, their wings were spread out upward, Each had 2 wings, one touching the wing of another creature on either side, and 2 wings covering its body. Now each of these creatures were actually angels. They were cherubim, who had also had the hands of a man, feet of a calf, and a wheel beside them. So they're obviously not a being or a creature that we would be familiar with here on earth. So carrying on with Ezekiel chapter 1, now verses 22 to 23, and also a portion from 25 to 27. So starting from verse 22, it said, "Spread out above the heads of the living creatures was what looked like an expanse, sparkling like ice and awesome. Under the expanse their wings were stretched out one toward the other, and each had 2 wings covering its body." Then going to 25 to 27 now. "Then there came a voice from above the expanse over their heads as they stood with lowered wings. Above the expanse over their heads was what looked like a throne of sapphire, and high above on the throne was a figure like that of a man. I saw that from what appeared to be his waist up, he looked like glowing metal, as if full of fire, and that from there down he looked like fire, and brilliant light surrounded him." And so Ezekiel, like other prophets, has this amazing start to his time as a prophet because of visions. Now cherubims are obviously angels whom the Lord uses to guard those things that are most sacred. So Ezekiel said in chapter 1 verse 28, "This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. When I saw it, I fell face down, and I heard the voice of one speaking." The Lord called Ezekiel to be his prophet, to speak his word to his people in Babylonian exile, and took him to the exiles who lived at Tel Abib near the Kebar River. He spent 7 days amongst them. As I've mentioned, he placed them with his people. As the 7 days drew to a close, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel, and we're going to go now to chapter 3 verse 17. "And he was told, 'Son of man, I have made you a watchman for the house of Israel. So hear the word I speak and give them warning from me.'" And so from this we know that the Lord's placed him amongst his people as a watchman to speak to them on his behalf. God then told Ezekiel to get up, leave the river, and go out to the plain. When he arrived, the glory of the Lord was standing there, appearing as he had when Ezekiel stood beside the Kebar River. So we find here that the Lord appears before Ezekiel. Ezekiel fell face down again, so the Holy Spirit raised him up and said in verse 24 to 27 of chapter 3, "Go, shut yourself inside your house, and you, son of man, they will tie with ropes. You will be bound so that you cannot go out among the people. I will make your tongue stick to the roof of your mouth so that you will be silent and unable to rebuke them, though they are a rebellious house. But when I speak to you, I will open your mouth, and you shall say to them, 'This is what the sovereign Lord says.'" So once again we see the Lord preparing Ezekiel to speak his word. We also get a bit of an insight here where it says that they're a rebellious house. Of course they are, because the Lord sent them into exile. So Ezekiel was told to take a clay tablet, put it in front of himself, and draw a picture of Jerusalem on it. Once he had finished this, he was told to lay siege to it with miniature siege ramps and build miniature encampments and miniature battering rams. He was then told to place an iron pan between himself and the city. He was to look at it under siege and lie on the left side for 390 days to represent the sin of the house of Israel for 390 years, and then lie down on his right side for 40 days to represent the sin of the house of Judah for 40 years. For the 390 days on his left side he would have food to eat and water to drink, but for the 40 days on his right side Ezekiel would have nothing. Tough, isn't it? It's amazing. So the Lord said to him in chapter 4 now of Ezekiel, verses 16 to 17, Son of man, I will cut off the supply of food in Jerusalem. The people will eat rationed food in anxiety and drink rationed water in despair, for food and water will be scarce. They will be appalled at the sight of each other and will waste away because of their sin. And so you can see the Lord's giving this information to actually represent the number of years of what's already come before them. And so it's very, very specific. Now the iron pan has a role to play, but obviously in those days it would be much like a mirror, a surface, because in those days mirrors didn't exist. They were something that was a shiny metal that was polished to be able to look into it. So carrying on, so then the Lord told Ezekiel to take a sharp sword and use it to shave off both his beard and the hair on his head. When he finished the symbolic days of the siege for which he was asked to lay on both his sides, he was to burn a third of his hair with fire inside the city to represent the many people who would die from plague or famine. Another third of this hair was to be cut into pieces to represent those who would fall by the sword outside the city walls, and then the last third of hair was to be scattered to the wind, with the exception of a few strands to represent those taken into exile or fleeing to neighbouring countries. So poor old Ezekiel, he's taking a sword to his head to remove all his hair. He's got to burn it. He's having to lie on his side without moving for a long, long time, and then he gets to have a relief for a moment to go on the other side, but then he doesn't get any food for 40 days. So it's a very, very tough thing to go through. So, sorry, just find my place here. Yeah, so God told Ezekiel to tuck through. Here we go. So God told Ezekiel, so this is in Ezekiel 5 now, verse 4. He told Ezekiel to tuck a few strands of hair away in the folds of his garment to represent the remnant who will survive all this, and from them take a few and burn them in the fire to represent a fire that will spread from there to the whole house of Israel. Next, Ezekiel was told to prophesy against the mountains, hills, ravines and valleys of Israel, for all the high places, altars and idols will be smashed. The towns laid to waste and people slain by the sword. Some will be spared though, for God wants them to remember he doesn't just threaten in vain. So we're obviously not rereading the whole Bible here. We're going to give you certain scriptures and give you an outline of what's being said and why. So finally, the Lord said to Ezekiel, now moving to chapter 7, verses 2 to 4. So again, Ezekiel 7, verses 2 to 4. Son of man, this is what the sovereign Lord says to the land of Israel. The end. The end has come upon the four corners of the land. The end is now upon you, and I will unleash my anger against you. I will judge you according to your conduct and repay you for all your detestable practices. I will not look on you with pity or spare you. I will surely repay you for your conduct and the detestable practices among you. Then you will know that I am the Lord. And again, in Ezekiel chapter 7, this time verses 5 to 7, and then I'm going to read a portion from verses 15 to 16. So starting with verses 5 to 7 of chapter 7, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Disaster, an unheard of disaster is coming. The end has come, the end has come. It has roused itself against you. It has come. Doom has come upon you, you who dwell in the land. The time has come, the day is near. There is panic, not joy, upon the mountains. And then to 15 and 16. Outside is the sword, inside are plague and famine. Those in the country will die by the sword, and those in the city will be devoured by famine and plague. All who survive and escape will be in the mountains, moaning like doves of the valleys, each because of his sins. And so the Lord's speaking very tough, direct words here. He is proclaiming the end is here, and there is going to be a lot of suffering that's going to happen. So Ezekiel shut himself in his house as the Lord had commanded. He set the clay tablet with the picture of Jerusalem he had drawn before him, and then placed the miniature siege emblems in place before it. The Lord asked him to do this because he knows that what do you think? Why did the Lord ask him to do that? Build the actual scene. Any thoughts? So I've given you the scripture for what he was told to do. Now we're going to look at Ezekiel himself and say, why did he ask Ezekiel to build something physical that he could see? Wouldn't the words be enough? A challenge? The point is that when we see things differently to when we hear things or speak things. And so what's happening here is that the Lord knows that the eye affects the heart. So when you see something that's really dire, it affects how you actually feel in your heart. And so the Lord's asking him to actually build this physical miniature so he can actually lie there, and he's making him stay in a position for a long time, so he's actually going to suffer and be in pain. And so this is part of what the Lord is doing. So then Ezekiel was required to take a sword that he had sharpened and used it carefully to shave off all his hair and all his beard and set aside his hair for later. Then he placed an iron pan before the mock scene he had created, lay down close by on his left side, and had himself tied with ropes so he could not move or go outside among other people. So the explanation for the iron pan, apart from creating a barrier or creating a mirror image depending on what side, is that the iron pan actually was there to represent an iron will. The determination of the Babylonians to conquer the city, and the determination of King Zedekiah to lead the people of Jerusalem to resist. And so he built this scene, and the Lord said what's going to happen outside the city and what's going to happen inside the city. Zedekiah is determined not to give in. The Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar is determined to wipe them out. And so there's this iron will on both sides that neither of them are going to give in. The purpose for Ezekiel being ordered to lie down was to actually represent the Babylonian army surrounding the city, preventing any supplies from going in and any people from going out. And so the symbolism of all the things that he's doing are understood with a purpose. So the prophet lay there, first on his left side for 390 days. I always wonder, how will we go? 390 days, your hands are tied, lying on one side, not moving. How sore would you get? You can't imagine, can you? And then, without any food or water, he was to lay on his right side for another 40 days. The people exiled from Jerusalem came to see him, whether as a curiosity because they were searching their conscience, but they understood what they saw represented the close siege of their beloved city. No doubt they had various opinions and things to say, but Ezekiel could not reply, for his tongue was stuck to the roof of his mouth, as the Lord said. So they would come in and speak, they could come in and look, he couldn't move, he was tied up, and in the last period of time he had no food or water, and so his tongue was stuck to the top of his mouth. So 14 months passed, and on the 5th day of the 6th month in 592 BC, the 6th year of captivity, the prophet was finally able to sit upright in his house during the day. Ezekiel retrieved the hair he had put aside and divided it into 3. The first portion he took over to the tablet and burnt it on the other side to represent those who would perish from famine and plague inside. The second portion he took over and cut into pieces in front of the tablet, representing those who would die by the sword outside the city walls. And the final third he took outside his house and scattered them in the wind to blow away, except a few strands that he tucked into his garment. Re-entering his home, he took out the few strands, and after separating them into 2 lots again, he burnt one lot and tucked the remaining few strands into his garment to represent the remnant who would multiply and spread again. On this same day, after finally fulfilling the Lord's command, he was sitting with the elders of Judah. And in Ezekiel chapter 8 verse 1 it says, when the hand of the sovereign Lord stretched out and lifted him by the hair on his head. And so he must have grown a bit of hair back. So it's very odd, isn't it? He stretched out and lifted him by the hair on his head. And it says that Ezekiel was taken up by the Spirit between heaven and earth in the vision of God. He was taken to Jerusalem, to various locations around the house, which means the temple of the Lord, and shown the sins that were being committed. He saw the idol that provoked jealousy in the entrance to the north gate of the inner court. He saw 70 elders worshipping at shrines to their own idols in a dark hole in the wall to the entrance of the court. He saw women mourning for the demigod Tammuz at the entrance to the north gate of the temple, and he saw 25 men bowing to the sun in the east at the entrance to the temple in the inner court. And so really what we're getting a picture of there is what the Lord's seeing, and it's being represented through to Ezekiel in this way and spoken about through the Bible. So this allows us to actually know exactly what was actually going on at the time. Now, you might recognise the name Tammuz. It's actually a month on the Hebrew calendar. Many of the months in the Hebrew calendar, in fact, are not Hebrew or Jewish. They are, in fact, Babylonian, and this is one of them. So Tammuz was an ancient Sumerian demigod, and that means he was a supposed offspring of a god and a mortal, of fertility and agriculture. During an annual festival for Tammuz, the Sumerian king at the time would take on the identity of this demigod and copulate with a priestess in the belief this would ensure fertility of animals and crops for the coming year. Now this is part of the Hebrew calendar. Tammuz then supposedly went back to an underworld when the hot summer weather would end fertility. The next season he would return yet again, and it was believed that prosperity would happen again, and so it went every year. Tammuz was reputed to be a beautiful and ancient Sumerian belief, said a goddess called Inanna, also known as Ishtar. Last week we spoke about the Ishtar gate, right, the ceremonial gate, the main entrance into the city of Babylon. So it's actually named after a goddess. So it's called the Ishtar gate. So he said So Tammuz was reputed to be beautiful, and ancient Sumerian beliefs that a goddess called Inanna or Ishtar was attracted to him and took him for her consort, but they fell out of relationship, so she set demons on him and they dragged him to this underworld. This meant he could never return, and she regretted this, so a pantheon of gods agreed to a compromise and had what's called Geshtinana, the sister of Tammuz, alternate time with him in the underworld, allowing him to come and go. Incredible story, isn't it? This is what's believed. But the fact is, this month is in the Hebrew calendar, and the entrance to the Babylonian city was called Ishtar Gate. So these things are very real. So this is the reason why in Ezekiel chapter 8 verse 14, when the women are mourning or weeping for the demigod Tammuz, it is meant to represent the supposed tears of Inanna or Ishtar that brought Tammuz back because she regretted having demons drag him down to this underworld. So this is part of that cyclical process. This mourning for the seasonal death and resurrection of a false demigod at the north gate of the house of the Lord infuriated God, as you could imagine. For his temple was sanctified only to himself. And this is only one of those groups that was what was going on. But this is what people believed. So God wasn't even in the picture. So God was angry. He appealed to Ezekiel. Should these people who provoke him to anger have any pity shown to them? But then he decided in Ezekiel 8 verse 18, I will deal with them in anger. I will not look on them with pity or spare them. Although they shout in my ears, I will not listen to them. Then the Lord cried out in Ezekiel 9 verse 1, bring the guards of the city here, each with a weapon in his hand. So we're very much at the pointy end of action here. The punishment is happening. We're finding out why God is angry. We're finding out what people are doing. Once again, we don't read this in Chronicles. We don't read this in Kings. We read this in the books of the prophets. So we get a much better picture of what's going on. So 6 guards arrived with deadly weapons, and a man clothed in linen accompanied them with a writing kit at his side. They all came and stood beside the bronze altar. So we're going to read now from Ezekiel 9, verses 3 to 4. It says, "Now the glory of the God of Israel went up from above the cherubim, where it had been, and moved to the threshold of the temple. Then the Lord called to the man clothed in linen and said, 'Go throughout the city of Jerusalem and put a mark on the foreheads of those who grieve and lament over all the detestable things that are done in it.' Ezekiel listened. Then the Lord said to the guards in verses 5 to 6, 'Follow him through the city and kill without showing pity or compassion. Slaughter old men, young men and maidens, women and children, but do not touch anyone who has the mark. Begin at my sanctuary.'" And so we get a very vivid picture there of this process starting off at the Temple of Jerusalem. The slaughter began with the elders in front of the temple and continued throughout the city. God told them to defile the temple and use the courts to bring the slain.
Can I just ask a question? Who is doing the slaying here?
So what it's, let me just check there again.
Is it Israelites doing the
The
slaying?
Lord called to the man clothed in linen. So it says 6 guards arrived with deadly weapons, and a man clothed in linen accompanied them with a writing kit at his side. They all came. So these are somebody that God has appointed. They're not given a name. And it says that there's 6 guards with deadly weapons that go with them. And so God's appointed someone in the city of Jerusalem to actually do this work. Yeah. So one gentleman with 6 guards with weapons to do this. Okay, so the slaughter began with the elders in front of the temple and continued throughout the city. God told them to defile the temple and use the courts to bring the slain. Ezekiel was on his own while this happened, and he fell face down and cried out in Ezekiel 9 verse 8, "Ah, sovereign Lord, are you going to destroy the entire remnant of Israel in this outpouring of your wrath on Jerusalem?" The Lord told Ezekiel he would kill all idolaters with no pity for what they had done. And so it was until the man in linen returned with his writing kit and said in verse 11, "I have done as you commanded." And so God's mercy has run out for these people who were idolaters. So the Lord said to the man in linen to fill his hands in Ezekiel 10 verse 2 with burning coals from among the cherubim and scatter them over the city. This he did, and then the glory of the Lord departed from the temple. So at this point in time, the Lord is no longer going to be present in the temple. And so another significant event. The Spirit lifted Ezekiel up and brought him to the gate of the house of the Lord that faces east. He saw men there plotting evil and giving wicked advice, who presumed nothing would happen to them. Finally, a message of comfort is given to Ezekiel concerning those who were exiled. And the Lord said in Ezekiel 11 verse 17, "I will gather you from the nations and bring you back from the countries where you have been scattered, and I will give you back the land of Israel again." So Ezekiel's received all of this very dire visions. He's been taken above the city. He's seeing these people who are going to be executed because of their idolatry. And so the Lord's counterbalanced that and said, all of this is going to happen to the remnant, apart from those who had the mark on them. All the people who have gone into exile are actually in exile because the Lord has plans to prosper them and to bring them back. And so Ezekiel gets this message of all this horrible stuff, that these people are going to meet their end, but at the same time he's told that that's not the end of all people. I'm going to bring the good people back.
So this is a vision. This hasn't actually happened yet.
Right,
Okay,
that's right.
Yes.
And so he said he's lifting him up and he takes him across and he shows him what's going to happen.
Okay.
That's correct, yep. So then the glory of the Lord left the city and stopped above the mountains east of it. The Spirit lifted Ezekiel up and brought him back to the exiles in Babylonia. In Ezekiel 11 verse 24 it says, in the vision given by the Spirit of God, to answer your question. So it was a vision. He didn't physically go. He told them everything that he had seen. So he then recounted what he saw to all the people in exile. So that's a lot to take in. But he's showing very clearly in detail, vivid detail, exactly what's going to happen to Ezekiel. Now in 592, while all this is happening, during the 6th year of Zedekiah's reign, we're going to switch back to the Pharaoh Psamtik II, who marched south to confront a Cushite king called Anilamani, who had revived the power of the kingdom of Napata, which is a city-state of Nubia on the west bank of the Nile River. So it's in today's northern Sudan. So I'm just going to put this map up as a refresh. What's been happening in Egypt throughout all this time is that Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt has been ruled separately. So Upper Egypt has actually been ruled by a king from Kush, or Nubia as it used to be called. Lower Egypt had been ruled from this city called Sais or Tanis by this Psamtik II. So basically there was two lots of rulers in this land. The Upper Egypt has been ruled for a long time by the priesthood, and then the Kushite pharaoh moved in and took over this particular region. And so this gives us a nice picture. So that's the first cataract there at Aswan, just to give you some idea of where we're talking about. So the Egyptian army advanced first to the large Nubian city called Nubs, and then to the capital city Napata, fighting and winning a series of brutal battles. Temples were looted, Kushite statues were destroyed, and cities were sacked. A stela that was erected at Thebes in Egypt in the 3rd year of the reign of Pharaoh Psamtik II stated that a heavy defeat was inflicted on the kingdom of Kush. And so of course this is that very place right here in the upper portion of Egypt. Now I have an excerpt from history which speaks about this, and it reads, the army that your majesty sent to Nubia has reached the land of Nubs. Nubians from all parts, meaning Kush, had arisen against him, their hearts full of anger when he attacked those who had rebelled against him there. Because he was furious at those who had risen against him, his majesty took part in the combat as soon as he reached the battle. The rebels capitulated before a single arrow was unleashed against them. Those who tried to flee did not succeed and were brought back as prisoners, 4,200 men. So this is historical documentation. So the campaign apparently was so devastating that the power of Kush was forever crushed. So future kings were unable to ever gain control over Egypt again, as they had in the past, and so fearful were they that the capital was moved further south to a place called Meroe. Later in the same year, Pharaoh Psamtik II then marched his troops across the Sinai Peninsula to the Levant, the territory on the east coast of the Mediterranean Sea, which the Babylonians call Hatti land. So this Pharaoh, having taken back the whole land, now what's he do straight away? He goes across Mount Sinai and he goes up into this region. So this is known as the Levant, the eastern end of the Mediterranean, and it's what the Babylonians call Hatti land. And so he's feeling powerful, and the Babylonians who've been coming this way, he wants to cut them off before they come down and invade his own country. So he's moving in this direction. So this, of course, includes the kingdom of Judah, and Zedekiah was called upon to join the Pharaoh with other small kingdoms and nations to provoke a revolt against the Babylonians. The Holy Bible simply says in Jeremiah 52 verse 3, or in 2 Kings 24:20, it's in both. So Jeremiah 52 verse 3 or 2 Kings 24 verse 20. It says, "Now Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon." So Zedekiah was put there, or Zedekiah, sorry, there's different pronunciations. He was put there as a puppet ruler for the Babylonians. And yet here we see that when the Egyptians advanced, he thought, oh good, I'll join them and we'll get rid of the Babylonians. Why? It's pretty obvious. Because all of his people have been taken away and he wanted to have his power back over his nation. So when it says here, it didn't say that he would become a vassal state of the Egyptians. It said that he would join them as an ally. And so this would then mean he is a autonomous kingdom once again. So this was his plans. So the purpose for putting that bit of Egyptian history in is to connect why Zedekiah rebelled against the Babylonians. Now the Babylonians were not like the Assyrians who came before them. They did not place garrisons or governors to rule foreign countries, but rather sent out campaigns to conquer and plunder and then return. The presence of the army of Pharaoh Psamtik II in the Levant served no purpose, for there was no enemy to fight, no kingdoms to subjugate, so he retreated back to Egypt. In February 589 BC, 3 years later, however, during the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign, the Pharaoh died of natural causes and he was succeeded by his son who was called Hophra, Hophra. The Egyptians had always been concerned about the threat of the Babylonian Empire reaching out to encompass their kingdom, so it was Pharaoh Hophra's interest to continue Egypt's presence in the Levant to serve as a buffer between them and the Babylonians. So of course King Nebuchadnezzar is not going to have anything of this, and so he sent forces to Hattiland, as they called it, and news of their presence spread throughout the region and made its way down to Egypt. Because of Zedekiah's rebellion, the Babylonians besieged the city of Jerusalem. So this is the reason why he besieged the city. So this background tells us why. And Zedekiah's first response was to send messengers to the prophet Jeremiah to ask him to pray to God for them. How extraordinary. They're doing all these evil things and yet he says, oops, things aren't going well, let's get Jeremiah. So news arrived that Pharaoh Hophra had dispatched an army to support and protect them. The Babylonians also heard this and decided to withdraw from Jerusalem. But Jeremiah told the messengers, Jehukal, son of Shelemiah, and the priest Zephaniah, son of Masai, to tell the king in Jeremiah 37, verses 7 to 8. Pharaoh's army, which has marched out to support you, will go back to its own land, to Egypt. Then the Babylonians will return and attack this city. They will capture it and burn it down. And so the king didn't hear what he wanted to hear. He heard that it was going to be burnt down around him. So because the Babylonian army withdrew with news of the Egyptians, Jeremiah started to leave the city to go to the territory of Benjamin, where he came from. In Jeremiah 37 again, this time verse 13, it says, But when he reached the Benjamin gate, the captain of the guard, whose name was Iriah, son of Shelemiah, the son of Hananiah, arrested him and said, You are deserting to the Babylonians. So Jeremiah flatly denied these false accusations, but he was arrested anyway. So they beat him up and they imprisoned him in a vaulted cell in the dungeon of a house that belonged to the secretary Jonathan. The house had been made into a prison because of the Babylonian siege. Jeremiah was to remain there for a long time. So the prophecy came true, for in the same year that Pharaoh Hophra's army withdrew quickly to avoid any major conflict with the Babylonians. And so this was part of Jeremiah's prophecy when he spoke about what would happen with the Egyptians. So there was a momentary vacuum in the presence of foreign forces. The Babylonians weren't there and the Egyptians weren't there. So King Zedekiah was unsure what to do. So once again he had Jeremiah brought to his palace and he asked in Jeremiah 37 verse 17, Is there any word from the Lord? The prophet answered, Yes, you will be handed over to the king of Babylon. The king didn't know what to say, but Jeremiah, who had been stuck in prison for some time, petitioned for his release. So now reading from verses 18 to 20, it says, "What crime have I committed against you, all your officials, all this people, that you have put me in prison? Where are your prophets who prophesied to you? The king of Babylon will not attack you or this land. But now, my lord the king, please listen. Let me bring my petition before you. Do not send me back to the house of Jonathan the secretary, or I will die there." So King Zedekiah had no reason to hold him, so he gave orders to place Jeremiah in the guard's courtyard and be given bread every day until there was no more. Foreboding, isn't it? Bread every day until there was no more. So obviously dire things to come. So Jeremiah was telling the people of Jerusalem, so we're going to go to 38 verse 2 in Jeremiah. "Whoever stays in this city will die by the sword, famine or plague, but whoever goes over to the Babylonians will live." Well, he'd be seen as a bit of a traitor perhaps by the king, because he's telling people if they go they'll be okay, if they stay they're going to die. And in verse 3 he goes on to say, "This city will certainly be handed over to the army of the king of Babylon, who will capture it." Jeremiah sounded treasonous. He was telling people to go to the enemy, and if they didn't they would die because the city would be destroyed anyway, or so the officials of Jerusalem thought. So in Jeremiah 38 verse 1 it says, "Shephatiah son of Matan, Gedaliah son of Pashur, Jehukal son of Shelemiah, and Pashur son of Malchiah heard what Jeremiah was telling all the people, and so they went and sought the audience of the king. King Zedekiah received the officials in the hall of justice, and the officials said to him in verse 4 of Jeremiah 38, 'This man should be put to death. He is discouraging the soldiers who are left in the city as well as all the people by the things he is saying to them. This man is not seeking the good of these people, but their ruin.'" So God had placed, as we can see here, Jeremiah beside King Zedekiah. But the king, it says in 2 Chronicles, verse 36, I'm sorry we're bouncing around to get the whole picture here. So we're going to go to 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verses 12 to 14. So 2 Chronicles 36, verses 12 to 14. "But the king did not humble himself before Jeremiah the prophet, who spoke the word of the Lord. He also rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar, who had made him take an oath in God's name. He became stiff-necked and hardened his heart and would not turn to the Lord, the God of Israel. Furthermore, all the leaders of the priests and the people became more and more unfaithful, following all the detestable practices of the nations and defiling the temple of the Lord, which he had consecrated in Jerusalem. So God had sent word to his people and their kings through many prophets over many years." And continuing on with 2 Chronicles 36, reading from verses 15 to 16, it says, "Because he had pity on his people and on his dwelling place. But they mocked God's messengers, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord was aroused against his people, and there was no remedy." So King Zedekiah was like a caged bird. He had no real power. So in Jeremiah, so back to Jeremiah again, chapter 38, verse 5 this time, he simply said, "He is in your hands, the king can do nothing to oppose you." In the guard's courtyard where Jeremiah was living, Malchiah, the son of the king, had a cistern with no water. The officials had Jeremiah seized and lowered him by ropes into the cistern, whose bottom was full of mud. Once he reached the bottom, they pulled the ropes back up, and Jeremiah was left to sink down into the mud. Doesn't sound very pleasant. So cistern, if you don't know, they're still in Israel. You can see some today. They're basically large cavernous holes that are cut into the rock, and they're basically simply storage devices for water. So in this particular instance, obviously all the sediment over all the years has settled down to the bottom. It says the cistern was empty, but there was a mud base. And so it says here that when they lowered him down, he was left to sink into the mud, so I can't imagine it'd be too pleasant. So King Zedekiah was sitting outside of his palace in the Benjamin gate, the same gate Jeremiah had tried to leave the city from earlier. Ebed-melech, a Cushite official from the royal palace, came out and found him and said in Jeremiah 38 verse 9, "My lord the king, these men have acted wickedly in all they have done to Jeremiah the prophet. They have thrown him into a cistern where he will starve to death when there is no longer any bread in the city." So there's that no longer bread in the city once again. The king ordered Ebed-melech to take 30 men and lift Jeremiah back out of the cistern. And so Jeremiah, remember when he was first commissioned by God, he said, "You're going to have a really hard time, but you're not going to get killed." So he's obviously suffering, but there's always something that happens where he gets rescued once again. So Jeremiah was lifted back out of the cistern, but he was to remain in the courtyard of the guard. Soon after, the king had Jeremiah brought to the third entrance of the house of the Lord. And he said in verse 14 of Jeremiah 38, "I am going to ask you something. Do not hide anything from me." The prophet was understandably sceptical of the king's intentions and replied in verse 15, "If I give you an answer, will you not kill me? Even if I did give you counsel, you would not listen to me." But true to the word of the Lord, the king swore an oath and promised he would neither kill him nor hand him over to others who sought to take his life. And thus far we've seen that's true, because every time someone came to him, he said to have him pulled back out or to be restored to a different location. So Jeremiah accepted this reassurance and said to King Zedekiah in verses 17 to 18 of Jeremiah 38, "This is what the Lord God Almighty, the God of Israel, says. If you surrender to the officers of the king of Babylon, your life will be spared and the city will not be burned down. You and your family will live. But if you will not surrender to the officers of the king of Babylon, this city will be handed over to the Babylonians and they will burn it down. You yourself will not escape from their hands." So King Zedekiah expressed his fear that the Babylonians would hand him over to those who had already gone over to them and that they would mistreat him. But Jeremiah said to him, so we're going to go to verses 20 to 23 of Jeremiah 38. Jeremiah said to him, "They will not hand you over. Obey the Lord by doing what I tell you. Then it will go well with you, and your life will be spared. But if you refuse to surrender, this is what the Lord has revealed to me. All the women left in the palace of the king of Judah will be brought out to the officials of the king of Babylon. Those women will say to you, 'They misled you and overcame you, those trusted friends of yours. Your feet are sunk in the mud, your friends have deserted you. All your wives and children will be brought out to the Babylonians. You yourself will not escape from their hands, but will be captured by the king of Babylon, and this city will be burned down." So the theme remains consistent. The city will be burned down all the way throughout. So Zedekiah told Jeremiah to keep the purpose of the conversation confidential and to tell others, if questioned, that he had pleaded not to be sent back to Jonathan's house. He was questioned. He said what the king told him, and once again he was returned to the courtyard of the guard until the day Jerusalem was captured. So going now to Jeremiah chapter 39 verse 1, it says, "So in the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, marched against Jerusalem with his whole army. They camped outside the city and built siege works all around it." Remember what Ezekiel had to do? He had to lie down for 392 days, wasn't it? And so here, what he actually represented is now taking place. So the Babylonians were merely the agents of God's judgment in this. This was no accident or will of man. It was the Lord who sent them to destroy the city and the temple of Jerusalem. Remember, he in the vision saw that the coals were taken, placed in the hands, and the Lord was no longer present in the house. So their sin that had defied God and broke his covenant for too long was the cause of their woes. So the people began to weep in their distress. Now we're going to move to some scriptures now from Lamentations, a book which is not often read. It's not a great joy to read this book. Obviously they're laments, so they're things that people think of in the future that happened in the past, and they lament over them because of something that happened that was really bad. So we're going to go to Lamentations chapter 2, and we're going to read from verses 11 to 12. So Lamentations 2, verses 11 to 12. And it reads, "My eyes fail from weeping. I am in torment within. My heart is poured out on the ground because my people are destroyed. Because children and infants faint in the streets of the city. They say to their mothers, 'Where is bread and wine?' As they faint like wounded men in the streets of the city, as their lives ebb away in their mother's arms." And so the Babylonians laid siege, which means no one comes in, no one comes out. Remember the vision that Ezekiel had. Remember what the Lord told him to do with the little miniatures. And so this is now happening. So the Babylonian siege stopped any supplies from coming into the city of Jerusalem and prevented any people from going out. The consequences were dire, and famine soon took a grip of the people. We can know from this that the work of the Lord is being done, because if an invading or raiding king from another nation was coming, they would come to loot, pillage and take it away. So they would fight them, probably try and get inside the city and take what was away. But they didn't do that here. They just came and stopped anyone from going anywhere. No fighting. And so this is the Lord's way. So going now to Lamentations chapter 4, we're going to read first from verses 4 to 5. And it says, "Because of thirst, the infant's tongue sticks to the roof of its mouth. The children beg for bread, but no one gives it to them. Those who once ate delicacies are destitute in the streets. Those nurtured in purple now lie on ash heaps." So what's the colour purple represent? Wealth, the royalty, the nobles. And so even they have nothing, is what it's saying. So now moving to Lamentations chapter 4 again, but verses 7 to 10, it carries on to say, "Their princes were brighter than snow and whiter than milk. Their bodies more ruddy than rubies, their appearance like sapphires. But now they are blacker than soot. They are not recognised in the streets. Their skin has shriveled on their bones. It has become as dry as a stick. Those killed by the sword are better off than those who die of famine. Racked with hunger, they waste away for lack of food from the field. With their own hands, compassionate women have cooked their own children, who become their food when my people were destroyed." And so we get this graphic picture painted of what it was like inside. And so we see the Lord's will be done. So going back to the book of Jeremiah, we're going to go back to chapter 32 now. And I hope all this is sort of painting a fairly vivid picture of what's going on. We find out tonight why Zedekiah changed his allegiance, and of course that gave an excuse, if you will, a worldly excuse for Nebuchadnezzar to come back and to attack and lay siege to them. But we know from the Bible that Nebuchadnezzar was about the Lord's business. So Jeremiah 32 verses 1 to 2. "This is the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord in the 10th year of Zedekiah king of Judah, which was the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar." Now you might notice that the previous scriptures that I was reading from said in the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon marched against Jerusalem with his whole army encamped outside. We are now in the 10th year of Zedekiah. So what we're saying is that this period of time that they're camped outside is becoming very long. It goes on to say, "The army of the king of Babylon was then besieging Jerusalem And Jeremiah the prophet was confined in the courtyard of the guard in the royal palace of Judah. It's now 588 BC, and the Lord said to Jeremiah, again in chapter 32, we're going to read from verses 28 to 29. I am about to hand this city over to the Babylonians and to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, who will capture it. The Babylonians who are attacking this city will come in and set it on fire. They will burn it down along with the houses where the people provoke me to anger by burning incense on the roofs to Baal and by pouring out drink offerings to other gods. God explained why in verse 31 when he says, from the day it was built until now, this city has so aroused my anger and wrath that I must remove it from my sight. So in other words, the city of Jerusalem has never been a city where idols haven't been worshipped. It's been a constant problem as we've read throughout all the journey through all the period of the kings. And so he's basically saying that's it. So God asked Jeremiah to go to Zedekiah while King Nebuchadnezzar, his army, and the armies of the kingdoms and peoples he ruled were fighting against Jerusalem, Lachish and Azekah. They were the only fortified cities still holding on in the kingdom of Judah. The prophet Jeremiah told Zedekiah what the Lord said. So in chapter 34 of Jeremiah, verses 2 to 5, it says, I am about to hand this city over to the king of Babylon, and he will burn it down. You will not escape from his grasp, but will surely be captured and handed over to him. You will see the king of Babylon with your own eyes, and he will speak with you face to face. So remember, this is Jeremiah addressing Zedekiah face to face. He says, you will see the king of Babylon, meaning Zedekiah, with your own eyes, and he will speak to you face to face. And you will go to Babylon, yet hear the promise of the Lord, O Zedekiah, king of Judah. This is what the Lord says concerning you. You will die peacefully, as people made a funeral fire in honour of your fathers, the former kings who preceded you, so they will make a fire in your honour. So going back to Jeremiah 39, verse 1, it says, and on the 9th day of the 4th month of Zedekiah's 11th year, the city wall was broken through. So we know they've been besieged for a long time, over a year at this point in time. Jerusalem was so strong that its people thought the enemy could never break through its walls. But a year and a half later, with the famine taking its toll, they could not hold out any longer. And on the 9th of Tammuz, which is June, July for us in our calendar, in 587 BC, the siege engines and the battering rams of the Babylonians finally broke through. In Jeremiah 39 verses 3 to 4, it reads on, then all the officials of the king of Babylon came and took seats in the middle gate, Nergal-Sharezer of Samgar, Nebo-Sarsekim, a chief officer, Nergal-Sharezer, a high official, and the other officials of the king of Babylon. When Zedekiah, king of Judah, and all the soldiers saw them, they fled. They left the city at night by way of the king's garden through the gate between the two walls and headed toward the Arabah. Now the Arabah, of course, is the Jordan Valley beneath the Dead Sea, heading south. So they were told, remember, the prophecy said that the Babylonians would come from the north, and so they're heading in the opposite direction. So the Babylonian army pursued Zedekiah and his soldiers and caught up with them on the plains of Jericho. As the enemy drew near, Zedekiah's soldiers separated and scattered, leaving their king on his own to be captured. Good soldiers. And so I just have another map here just as a refresh. So here is the Arabah down here. It's this region right down here between Jordan and Israel today. So it says that they came and went, and down they went to run away. The Babylonians we know came from here, and from here when they attacked. So they went in the opposite direction there. So as the soldiers came, Zedekiah's soldiers took off. So King Nebuchadnezzar was at Riblah in the land of Hamath. So he was stationed here. This is a staging post that comes up many times in the Bible. So this is where they rest, refresh before they go off to war. When the Egyptians went up to Karshemish to fight, this is where they stopped. And the reason is there's a river here called the Orontes. It's very lush, and so it's a good place for people to have a rest, get water, feed their livestock before they enter into battle. So all of his soldiers had gone ahead of him, and Nebuchadnezzar's still here at Hamath at this point in time. So they took Zedekiah to him and pronounced sentence upon the rebellious king. Zedekiah's sons and officials had also been gathered and brought there. And he was forced to watch his sons and officials slaughtered before his eyes. In Jeremiah, jumping to chapter 52, verse 11, it then goes on to say, then he put out Zedekiah's eyes, which means they removed them, basically. Bound him with bronze shackles and took him to Babylon, where he put him in prison till the day of his death. And so we find out from this now, here's Daniel and his administrators ruling over here. Jehoiakim is in jail with his sons, and now Zedekiah, without his sons because they're all murdered, is placed in the same prison. Zedekiah is the uncle of Jehoiakim. And so over here it's very busy. We've got multiple generations of kings and exiles. We've got them being ruled over, but God's prophecy said that he wouldn't die of an unnatural death. And so here he is in the prison, not being able to see, with Jehoiakim in Babylon. Daniel's upstairs in the palace ruling. Ezekiel's down here in the poor amongst the people. And of course, Jeremiah's still over here at this point in time. He's about to take off from there. So going back to the period, there were no kings to rule the Israelites, so we're just about to wrap up. The people of Israel asked for a king to rule over them. So this is the big picture. But of course this was not God's wish, as he explained to the judge Samuel in Samuel 8 verses 7 to 8. So Samuel 8 verses 7 to 8. He said, listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. So clearly the Lord knew what was going to happen before it did. Clearly God did not see the need for kings, as he was the ultimate king of his people. Giving in to the people's request, God answered Samuel in verse 22 of 1 Samuel chapter 8. Listen to them and give them a king. You might remember Samuel's two sons. They were down in Beersheba and they were not walking with the Lord. And so Samuel was in a bother because he thought there was no one to become the next judge. And so he asked for a king. And so this was the conversation that happened at that time. Given the chance for self-rule, God said this would fail and the people would complain bitterly. But because it was what they wanted, he would not listen to their complaints. Coming full circle, God's word is fulfilled after many generations. God finally curses King Jehoiakim, so none of his descendants will sit on an Israelite throne. And we mentioned this last week in Jeremiah 22 verse 30. It says, this is what the Lord says, record this man as if childless. A man who will not prosper in his lifetime, for none of his offspring will prosper. None will sit on the throne of David or rule any more in Judah. So King Jehoiakim made it to the throne, but God's promise to his father King Jehoiakim saw the rule by this bloodline come to an end. Thus his son Shealtiel, who we're going to come to next, was the first heir of his family not to ascend to the throne. In Jeremiah 36 verse 30 it says, therefore this is what the Lord says about Jehoiakim, king of Judah, he will have no one to sit on the throne of David. After the final demise of Jerusalem and Judah, the line of David continues through the son of King Jehoiakim in exile, and his name is Shealtiel, which is spelled Shealtiel. Israel. And you can look that up in 1 Chronicles chapter 3 verses 17 to 18, and of course it's also in the genealogy of Jesus. So following the demise of the kingdom of Judah, we're now going to move into a new period of history where the Israelite people no longer have their own home nor their own land. So this brings us to the end of the genealogy, which takes us from kingship to captivity with the Babylonians, and we're going to embark next on the final stage from kings to Christ. So we're about to move into all the descendants who people predominantly don't know. So I'm just going to put up this chart, which we've put up many times before. You see here is King Jehoiakim. King Zedekiah was not part of the genealogy of Jesus. However, he is mentioned because it talks about the brothers of Jehoiakim. Right, so Jehoiakim, Jehoahaz, and Zedekiah are all family. Jehoiakim is the son of King Jehoiakim. And so they were all related together. So their family finished off the kingship there. The next person is going to be Shealtiel, which we'll commence with. And that brings us into this period of time where they're in exile. So we're going to pass through and explain all of this. Zerubbabel will be the person who will bring them back out of Babylonian exile into what will become known as the province of Judea. No longer will it be a kingdom. And then we move through all of these descendants all the way through to Jesus, of which there is no story in the Bible. However, the Bible has a story to tell because it's told through the prophets, predominantly Daniel. And so what we're going to do is we're going to follow what happens in history and align it with the prophecies and the words of Daniel to follow through. We're going to move through several different empires. This is the empire of the Babylonians. It only goes for 70 years. After the Babylonians, we have the Persian Empire who will come next, and this was part of the prophecy that Daniel explained to Nebuchadnezzar. And so Cyrus the Great will be the people who release Zerubbabel with the Babylonian exiles back into the province of Judea. And so the history then will continue on with the Persian Empire, and then the Greek Empire starts. And we have the demise of the Persian Empire, we move into the Greek, and then that of course is followed by the Roman Empire until the time of Christ. And so this gets difficult because there's a lack of information in the Bible about the individuals, but the fact that they were actually named and placed in history and in the genealogy of Jesus means that they were people who lived throughout these times of the different empires. And so, as I said, on our next lesson we will continue, and we're going to go to Babylon, obviously to see what happens and continue on from that point there. So that brings us to a close. So that brings us to the end of the period of kings in the Bible. It's got a very simple story. A lot happened over many years, but at the end of the day, the Lord said there shouldn't be an earthly king. He knew what would happen since the throne of David, and of course it all collapsed and he punished them. And so what we find in the history books and in the Bible prior to Jesus is that all of his forefathers were not perfect people with perfect bloodline. We find that they had all sorts of people there. So thank you so much. We're just going to pop up our end screen before we close. You can watch this back on Facebook if you'd like to see it on Facebook once more. All the videos are recorded and they're placed onto our YouTube channel. You type in Paul Brunson, the Jesus Movement, and you can subscribe there. Or you can watch them on our website at thejesusmovement.com.au. So thank you so much for joining us. God bless you, and we look forward to your company next time.